Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Civic Forum. My name is Rory Truex. I'm Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. I started the Civic Forum this past summer as a place for people to think about the bigger picture issues facing democracy in the US and elsewhere. And today I'm delighted to have a session on the relationship between democracy and the business community and why the business community needs to be actively engaged in democracy and promote democracy. And I'm delighted to welcome Daniella Ballou-Aares, the founder of the Leadership Now project. You might have heard of Leadership Now, which made headlines last year with its Pass the Torch initiative, when more than 450 business and civic leaders urged President Biden to step aside for new leadership. Since then, Leadership Now has kept the pressure on. This past summer, they were rallying over 250 CEOs to defend America's research universities. They also helped elevate pragmatic pro-business governors in New Jersey and Virginia, where centrist candidates won by sweeping double-digit margins just this week. It's all part of their long-term talent push, which is to support leaders from the military, science, engineering, and business to help build power for people to do real things. So thank you to Daniella for joining me today on the Civic Forum.
Pleasure to be here, Rory.
And so, Daniella, one thing you're known for, and a lot of your different commentary, is trying to convince the business community that it is in their interest to take a more active role in promoting democracy itself. So can you tell us a little bit about the philosophy behind your work at Leadership Now and how you've been able to get that message out?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks again for having me. Timely. Your podcast is very timely, and the topic. I wanted to say just one thing into the framing of the work that we do as an organization that I've done. I don't think first and foremost my role has been to convince the business community that the rule of law matters and that democracy matters. It's actually been to bring together those who know very well that that's the case.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's something that's key. There are many in the business community who see the importance of a system that is fair, that enables competition, that is built on the rule of law. But there's been not a good way to bring together that coalition of the willing, so to speak, in an effective way, because many of the existing business organizations and entities in politics are built for a very narrow purpose. They're industry associations, they're chambers of commerce, they focus on narrow tax and regulatory interests of their particular industries. And so there's not been um, a really an organized effort to have kind of a medium to long term view among business leaders around what we need to have a functioning democracy and economy. And that's why I founded the organization in 2017. There seems such a gap between what we would see, for instance, coming from think tanks and organizations that focused on policy, and those who were more political, chambers of commerce, industry associations, et cetera. And so we've really sought to fill that gap, bring together the leaders who are understand the importance of a strong democracy and political system, but then also, of course, convince our peers and provide the type of academic analysis, evidence, and credible leadership that not only is about convincing others in the business community, but it's about making more visible what it means to have a strong foundation for a capitalist economy, and to have the rule of law to be free of cronyism and retaliation, et cetera, versus not. And I think that's becoming that much more real in the current administration than what we have seen really ever in our lifetimes in terms of the role of government and how it's interacting and affecting business and the competitiveness of our economy. I can say a couple of other things. I think evidence of that and evidence of the concern is we just did a poll, our second poll, the Leadership Now Harris poll, that looks at sentiment in the business community, level of concern with the political environment and legal environment right now. The first one we did in April, the one we did today showed 84% of business leaders, this is C-suite executives, were concerned or very concerned about the political climate. That's consistent from April of this year, when it was just after tariffs were implemented. So we've seen a high level of concern consistently, even if that's not something that's vocalized across the board. And as you spoke to, when we think about solutions to the current situation, we see two pillars to that really, which is policy and people. Right. So we need a policy agenda not only around our institutions and strengthening and kind of redesigning and rebuilding them, uh, but also from our perspective, we need a policy agenda that's focused on growth, competitiveness, and creating a broad-based kind of economic system that works for Americans more broadly. And that's only become more clear as we came out of the 2024 election and we look at what's happening now across many political races where there's issues like affordability, inflation, et cetera, a real economic policy agenda that addresses uh, the future of workforce, technology, immigration, et cetera. We believe that that needs to be paired with this kind of reinforcement and respect for the rule of law in the political system. And then the second pillar of our work is people, right? So we could come up with a nice policy agenda, but if you do not have the leaders to take that forward, it's not going to get you anywhere. And that's why we've been so active, as you mentioned, last year and calling on Biden to pass the torch, why we've supported amazing emerging leaders, some of whom were just very successful this week. Mikey Shell and Abigail Spanberger, who we identified in 2018 as great emerging political leaders. We need to be able to have a cadre of leaders who are prepared, capable, competent, and from our perspective, able to reach the center in their agenda and message to take us forward.
Thank you for that. And I want to go back to this poll that you referenced, and I think I'm looking at the same data. One thing that's interesting about it is the concern about the business climate and the political climate is across the ideological spectrum. So I think it was 83% of Republicans, 91% of Democrats, and 81% of independents. So a little more concern among the Democrats, but still high levels of concern among Republican business leaders. And I'm curious about your experience building this sort of cross-partisan coalition in the business community.
I do think it's notable, as you said, that the concern levels are across the board. And I'll give an example. We have Leadership Now has chapters across the country. We have members in more than 25 states. And we have 8 chapters. And one of the states we're working to build in is North Carolina and to grow our presence there. And I was there recently. And it was very interesting to hear that an industry that is very concerned, of course, with administration is the furniture industry in the country, in that state, because the tariffs have been so significantly impacting them. So it's a domestic industry, as we're seeing many times, but of course they import a lot of their goods or parts of their goods, even if they do some manufacturing here. And that is an industry that has leaned in the state more Republican. The industry associations have leaned more Republican. So I think because there's a whole set of economic measures that impact many different industries, leaders, et cetera. I mean, I was recently with a friend who's the CFO of a very large company, and they were seeing hundreds of millions of variations in their P&L just based on what the latest tariff moves were, which were changing consistently. So I do think there's just the basics of running a business, the chaos, the uncertainty. That's not a partisan experience. That's just experience of how do I run my business, small or large, in an environment like this.
Well, and one thing you've been you're getting at is this sort of the political climate has really changed. And so I'm a political scientist, and in our community, we view the current moment as part of the process of what we will call democratic backsliding. It's a very academic term, but the process through which democracies erode. And when you see that environment change, it is generally accompanied by changes in the way business is done. When we look at fully authoritarian countries, I've studied China, their business success is in part determined by your relationship with the big guy, with the leader. And so a lot of businesses have to spend a lot of resources cultivating those types of personal relationships with the ruling party. That's point one. Point two is by extension, political retaliation is a real thing, right? So if you cross the line, all of a sudden your business can be really jeopardized because of your politics. And then point three is corruption. And people often think these authoritarian governments are efficient and clean. Empirically, no, no, no. Corruption is actually generally part of how these governments function, because they need that. The corruption is kind of the glue which holds the ruling coalition together. And so I don't want to say we're in a full authoritarian moment, but I think we are experimenting with a mode of governance that's not really fully democratic anymore. And you're seeing these practices start to affect the American business community. I don't know. I don't want to put words in your mouth. What is your reaction to that?
I think that's certainly true. And I think most, I can't imagine there's more than a few CEOs who don't see that, right? Who don't see that the president is expecting businesses to contribute to his um, restructuring of the White House, let's call it, or do deals with the government, or allow the government to take a share, or you know to engage in a crypto business and um, pardon, as he pardoned the Binance founder, et cetera. I think those things are clear to many, and the question is, um, when is there a moment and levers to be effective at kind of reining that in, right? So we are seeing specific examples of the business community. So let's take H-1B visas, for instance,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I think that is a good example of kind of chaotic decision making that doesn't adhere to the rule of law. The president can wake up one morning and decide he wants to put $100,000 kind of tax on H-1B visas. He experienced immediate pushback publicly and privately from the business community. And now the US Chamber of Commerce and the American Association of Universities have a case against that, the H-1B visa fees, as does a coalition of unions, medical organizations, and others. And so, that I think is a very deliberate an example that has a very deliberate set of responses. I mean, the tariffs right now are in the Supreme Court, right? So I do think that some element of public, legal, et cetera, responsive, plus pushback and engagement with Congress to try to reduce the impact of some of these moves is happening. Uh, but I think the personalization of commercial activity around the president is very worrying, and is something that I don't think the business community um, would want to see again. And I would hope there would be a window of opportunity with the next president to really think about what that means from a legal perspective. How do we really put better guardrails around that kind of personalization? But obviously, that's that's to come in the future.
Well, and this last remark you made really dovetails with a lot of different conversations I've had over the last couple months, which is the core issues with our system are being exposed right now in plain view. And once this chapter is over, whenever that is, it may well create the appetite for political reform and political change, thinking about the relationship between money and politics, the financial relationships of the president and other people in offices. So there, it's not going to happen immediately, right? This is not quite the moment for political reform, but it could be shortly after.
Can I
Um,
add
yeah,
one
yeah,
thing
please.
on that? Is that I think the tendency would be, the response to this needs to be kind of reining in corporate power more, right? This is an example of extraction from the system between the president and businesses. But I think actually this is a moment where it's really about the extraction of a small group of crony capitalists. And
Mhm.
there is an opportunity to have a shared interest across, most legitimate industry, to really think together about what are the kind of guardrails that are good for our economy and business, and good for the American people, so that there's not that kind of extraction. So I do think it's, um, many, as I said before, many in business would see this, would be concerned. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, so I don't exactly see as forward leaning on all the everything as I might want to see. But I think the fact that they've taken the H-1B visa case, and they took it as, if you look at those legal filings, it is a rule of law argument
Mhm.
that they're making. And so I think rule of law is deeply in the interest of business, and that can create a really important coalition opportunity as we go forward, both in the short term and in the longer term.
I want to get to your theory of change because in academia, every now and then, a bunch of professors sign a letter, and it's often actually very hard to get professors to engage in collective action because we're non-responsive to email.
I've experienced that in all of federation academia.
We're a tough bunch, but good God, and then we write these letters. There was a letter about the China initiative. There was things going on about the attacks on universities this spring. And you get a lot of big names, 500, 1,000 names. And there's always this question of, well, what is that accomplishing? And I would love to hear more about your experience at Leadership Now. You do some of that. I've seen public statements coming out from either you or large numbers of people in your organization. But beyond letters, like how do you feel like you can affect change and push back effectively? I just think this is a question on a lot of people's minds, especially even normal citizens who are out there protesting, who are upset. But there's always this question of, well, I'm upset, but how do I actually affect change and push back? So what are your lessons learned on that front?
Yeah. Look, as an organization, we think about three things that we do with our members that enable us to have impact. First is informing our members and the broader business community. So getting people smart to really understand the issues, what's happening. That's where we work with a lot of academic partners and put out analysis, and do conferences and briefings, et cetera. The second is influence, which is what you're really talking about, right? How do we influence the policy environment, the political environment? And third is investment. So where do our members put resources? What are the types of candidates they support? What are the types of organizations that are doing important work? And so we see those as really all critical pillars. And when we think about influence, which is really the top of it all for us, right? So the most important thing is, how do you influence the system in a productive direction? That is a mix of public, as you talked about, but much of it is also, where are we having influence with our peers in the business community, with political leaders, and a lot of that is quiet. It's quiet because it's helping people understand the issues, having conversations, informing our members who might make certain decisions in their business. For instance, we saw many of our members tell the law firms that they worked with that they did not expect them to make a deal with the administration. And even they encouraged them to support amicus briefs for those firms who had been had executive orders, right? So that's an example of something that's not public.
Yeah.
But it's a very clear, effective move that can also happen. We were part of passing Electoral Count Act reform. We were one of the organizations that supported that several years ago, that clarified the transition of power between presidencies, right? Which I'm sure you know well.
Yeah.
But that was very much our relationships in Congress, engaging with them and making the case for why business wanted stable reforms, getting our members to do that engagement with the Senate in particular. So the way I see it is, public statements we're very judicious about, and we do them when we have other pieces of the picture are coordinated with that. So for instance, when we called on Biden to pass the torch, we were doing that knowing that there were many members of Congress who thought that was the right thing for the president to do, to ensure we had the strongest candidate, that they had the strongest candidate for president. But they were fearful of coming out because there was pushback from the White House, there was pushback from advocates. So we were public on the importance of we were, the first organization very early to come out. And then we also highlighted and supported candidates who were willing to come out publicly, who wanted to, but were fearful that they would lose support. And we were engaging with political leaders every day around how we could be supportive, what needed to happen, et cetera. So it wouldn't have been effective if we just did a public statement and it was disconnected from what was happening in the political environment. Same thing with our defense of universities earlier this year. That was paired with coordinating with the university associations and engaging with Congress, which I think that scale of advocacy that happened did lead Congress to reduce some of the cuts to funding, the endowment tax, et cetera, that were attached. So as an organization, we're always kind of pairing those pieces together, and we don't want to come out all the time. We want it to come out on things that's clear. There's both a business interest or a long-term economic interest like universities, and a role for our members to play that's unique and effective.
Well, I'm smiling to myself because just hearing you talk, it's not obvious, but I think about the way you're thinking about these questions, and then how in my world how these things are done, which is letter goes around on some Google Doc, a bunch of people sign it, it's put on the internet, and that's it. And then we get upset when change doesn't happen. And pairing that type of public activity with that behind the scenes work, that relationship building. And that's, again, where your organization really can play a big difference, because the folks that are part of it are people with big networks, and networks in different parts of the political community and the business community. And so they can exert an influence in a way that maybe we don't often see in the public eye. So I'm going to keep that in mind next
I've
time
learned
a
that, by the
petition.
way, that we took that lesson from political scientists. So it's taking your own,
No, it's
not the way
sad.
you organize, but from the history. Like, look, if you
Yeah,
look
yeah.
at the Federalist Society, for instance, right, which built off of conservative Yale law students, and then grew to be an extremely influential network through those university networks, through the alumni networks, ultimately influencing the Supreme Court. We've taken a page back from that. We're built on alumni networks, and originally Harvard Business School alumni, now broader. We have alumni from many different universities, but we see those networks as a way to create a basis of people with common kind of academic foundations, common networks, ways of engaging in the world. And then you pair that with business networks, there is a lot of power there. And I think you have to use that responsibly. But I think we all appreciate, and we have learned from our own academic experience and the many academics we've worked with with leadership now, a steep appreciation for how foundational all of all of these issues are, to our country. So I think we see that as assets that we need to bring to the table, and that many movements, whether it's the Federal Society or like the suffragettes, I always think of I guess you're not supposed to say suffragettes anymore, the suffragists, but the suffrage movement was very effective at having kind of really out front activists, and then kind of quieter networks of women with links to various power centers who are pushing to make that happen. And I think every effective advocacy movement has those different pillars, and we're like a piece of a broader set of actors that are working in kind of generally the same direction.
Well, one thing I think universities are struggling with, and I'm curious what your read on the business community is basically solidarity, right? So we're seeing a pattern emerge in the Trump administration where there are certain actors that there's sort of an ideological attack that is levied on some, but it has implications for all, right? So in universities, we've seen really it's Harvard and Columbia, among others, but it's Harvard and Columbia, I think, have borne the brunt of the initial foray, the initial attacks. In journalism, we see the Associated Press early on. In the legal community, we see the firms that represented it, that were part of litigation against Trump that are now being attacked. And there's always this question of, well, do we join in solidarity with the others, or is this an opportunity, right? And even in academia, you would think universities all play nice with each other. Universities are very competitive, and I think there are some universities, I won't name names, that have seen openings here. Maybe they can be a little bit closer with the Trump administration. That might help them with grants. It might help with other things. And so but for me, again, as a social scientist, like, the collective pushback is really important, because these types of governments in general attack and they try to make an example and then others fall in line through kind of a chilling effect. And the only way you can push back against that is through coordination. And that's why I think your organization is so important, because you need people behind the scenes to facilitate that. So I'm curious, the business community is in a new world in the last 8 months or so. How have you seen this play out?
Yeah. I mean, look, moments like these, as you say, there's massive collective action problems, right?
Yeah.
Because most actors are unhappy with the current situation, but in absence of working together, it's very difficult to move things. I guess I would say a couple of things. I do think, as much as I think I would argue some of what's happened was not entirely unpredictable, I
Mhm.
with this president. I do not think organizations, whether business or universities, were prepared for what happened. And so it has taken, I think it's understandable that it also takes a bit of time for institutions to gain their footing. So it's been, you know, 11 months since
Yeah.
the president was inaugurated. That's not a long time to completely reorient your institution and understanding of how you're going to respond. So, one, I would say I see some promising moves. I think the fact that the compact that was presented to universities just last month was rejected by nearly all of them. Even if they didn't do it all together, they all did it in various ways. I think that was really important. I do think on the business side, I certainly believe there's more opportunity for some of the existing entities, whether it's the Business Roundtable or the Chamber, et cetera, to be more proactive in terms of how they respond to whether it's an economic move like tariffs or a rule of law erosion like deployment of the National Guard. That said, I do think where the most immediate and natural action can happen on a lot of these issues is at a state level. And we have seen real action at a state level. So, for instance, in Wisconsin, our members who have always been very involved in supporting trust in elections, rule of law, et cetera, in April, there was a Supreme Court race that was going to be critical to both the ability to do objective redistricting in the state and to have a Supreme Court that was, upholding the rule of law. And our members came out there, on a bipartisan basis and said, this candidate for the Supreme Court is a kind of centrist pro-business candidate who's going to help our state move forward. They were on this other side of Elon Musk, who was supporting a Republican candidate, and the candidate they supported won. But they were visible, they were public. That was a risk, but ultimately, I think it only increased the respect of their peers in the state to be able to say something. You look at Los Angeles when the National Guard was deployed. Very quickly, the Los Angeles Chamber came out and made a statement about ICE enforcement and how it was unhelpful to the business community in Los Angeles. I've already mentioned H-1B visas and the pushback that's happened there. Costco, the administration went after on DEI, and Costco said, no, we're not going to remove our DI related programs. We'll adhere to the law, but we're not going to follow that. And their customer loyalty went up,
Yeah.
and they succeeded. So I don't, again, business is not a monolith. Not everyone has been silent, but there's still plenty to do. And we like to see ourselves as both sometimes publicly and sometimes quietly helping move the needle forward and have a group of members who are well informed and either collectively or in their individual realms are helping make the right decisions about how to respond on these issues.
Well, and what's interesting is so yesterday my conversation was with Ezra Levin of Indivisible, who's
Mhm.
played a big role in No Kings and mass mobilization. And your two organizations are operating with different communities, but actually ultimately for the same end. But one thing that's interesting is this question of using mass pressure to help business do the right thing, so to speak. And I think back to the Jimmy Kimmel incident this summer. a lot of people canceled Disney Plus, and I don't know if that's what moved the needle ultimately for Disney, but putting pressure, the public putting pressure on business when they're in these moments, and you feel for Disney. Not I mean, I don't have that much sympathy for Disney, but like they're in a tough position, right? And it's they're caught between two different forces. So I'm curious for you, like, what do you see the role of the public, normal people, in applying a little bit of pressure? We see the same thing now, and I think there's a campaign against Spotify because Spotify has recruitment ads for ICE on its platform, and so there's a campaign to stop Spotify subscriptions, these sorts of things. So I'm curious how you see the intersection between the business community and then what we would call mass mobilization, and how do they intersect?
Yeah, look, I think the Jimmy Kimmel example was a very powerful one in that it was such a clear example of overstepping on free speech that appealed to people across the political spectrum and obviously mobilized the public. And I think that was effective. And it frankly created space for the leadership of the company to do something that perhaps they would like to do, but had felt, like you said, concerned, conflicted, et cetera. So that was an important signal. I do think, like anything, too much diffuse corporate advocacy towards corporates, I think ends up not at some point not doing much. So I do think, like I said, we're very judicious when we come out. I do
Hmm.
think really being thoughtful about what are the types of pressure and for what
Hmm.
purpose can make that type of advocacy most effective. And it's organic. I mean, Jimmy Kimmel, there wasn't an advocacy group like planning for months and months and months for Jimmy Kimmel to be fired, right? It had to be where there was the organic and then some organizing capacity that paired with that to have an impact.
Well, and I think it's this balance between standing up for what's right, but also not fatigue. And if you have a new boycott every week or two, they wind up
Yeah,
not mattering because it's hard to get. If there's nothing worse than a boycott, which people don't participate in, and it just reveals weakness. And I almost view it as like focal moments, like significant things that it's quite clear that some malfeasance is going on, and then that can be a court. And like Jimmy Kimmel, not everybody loves Jimmy Kimmel, but he's famous. And if we take a comedian off TV because maybe they make a bad joke that might have not been in poor taste, and the president doesn't like them, that we can all tell that that's a problem for our
yeah,
democracy, right, and for freedom of
yeah.
speech. And so I agree with you. I think that was a really heartening moment where the right level of pressure, the right level of concern was levied, and then there was a small victory. And another theme of some of my conversations has been that all of these little victories matter. So it's not an all or one.
Exactly.
It's not like democracy
Exactly.
is either dead or not. It's all of these little things that are able to be pushed back against, whether it's H-1B visas, some of the tariffs, they add up to something. And so I would encourage
Exactly.
people to think about it that way, as opposed to full win or loss.
What I feel like is, just to add to this a little bit, what I feel like unhelpful is the generic ask to business to not be silent. Right? Like, I
Yeah,
feel
yeah.
like if I get another New York Times op-ed that's like, business is too silent, I'm like, okay, but it has to be more specific in
Hmm.
terms of when are the moments, what are the issues, et cetera. I'm not asking the media to define those for business, but I do think the generic critique is not terribly instructive for what are the issues, actions, and moments that matter. And then the second concern I have with the narrative that business is silent or that business is, um, represented by some combination of Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Jeff Bezos, and a few others, is it's such a narrow conception of business. There are tens of thousands of executives across this country, across many industries who are influential, right? But they don't have. There's a very limited number of brand name business people. So I do think it's important to both, and that's why I'm always bringing the examples of here's things that are being done, here's where leadership is being demonstrated, both because we want to build on that progress, but also if if business people internalize the narrative that all of their peers are silent, you're
Mhm.
actually encouraging people to be silent. you're telling them that that's the right response. And so I think we're very conscious of, let's give people clearer paths to doing things that matter. And that's not always being public. That's things they do in their companies. That's supporting great candidates who are going to win by 13% margins, as Mike Shell and Abigail Spanberger just did. There's not only one path to doing something meaningful in a context like this, because we know pushback matters, winning election matters, and building for the medium term the sensibilities among business people or among any community around how to think about the moment, how to respond, and what they can do that matters, I think is super critical.
Well, and I appreciate that point, which is that, the business community is most effective at weighing in on the subset of issues that are really affecting the business community, right? And it could be a lot of different things. But it doesn't mean it's all issues. And I think this is a very diffuse movement for kind of restoring and protecting democracy. And each different community plays a part, right? So you saw a lot of people in the science community, the health community push back against some of the claims about autism and vaccines and all of these things. And that makes sense because that's their area of expertise, that's their domain. And so I think another way of rephrasing what you said is like domain specific activism and pushback, I think is the most reasonable expectation for folks.
And it's also, yeah, so the healthcare industry, that's relevant too, right? Not every industry, but
Yeah.
what's happening at the CDC or elsewhere, healthcare companies are concerned and are weighing in. And then there's geographic specificity, right? States like Massachusetts, North Carolina are deeply affected by research funding cuts, et cetera. So you can expect companies in those states are more likely advocates on those issues.
I wanted to touch on something which you brought up, which is that the business community, there are some folks in the business community, and you named Elon Musk, Zuckerberg, people like Peter Thiel, and they're very prominent people, name brands, as you said, that have decided to basically, in different ways, cozy up to this administration. And within a subset of that group, there are kind of what I would call the open embrace of authoritarian principles. There's a little bit of authoritarian envy, this idea that democracy is inefficient, nothing can get done, and we need stronger executives, which is sometimes just a euphemism for kind of a more authoritarian governance style. And you see that emerge on the far right. There's people like Curtis Yarvin who are openly talking about monarchy. Um, and and I'm curious what you think about that. And can you help us understand? I know you're DC, New York based. I tend to think of that mindset as coming out of the tech world for some reason. But I'm curious what you think about what I would call this authoritarian envy among a very, very small subset of the business community.
So a couple of things I want to say about the dynamics in the tech community here, and I'll get back to the kind of embrace of authoritarianism. But I do think if we look at the Biden administration, the kind of transition from the first Trump to Biden, where the tech community was, largely supporting Democrats, reasonably pro-democracy, et cetera. There was certainly some thinking already happening, but that was less so. I do think something we need to acknowledge is that I think politically the engagement with tech, which has become increasingly powerful over time, was not very effective. Uh, I think Biden was not seen as very present. I think the administration was not seen as being strategic and understanding the future of technology and how it would engage. And I don't say that in like a narrow tax and regulatory sense, right? Like, oh, they were taxing tech too much or they were trying to regulate it away. I would say I put this in a somewhat broader strategic view of Silicon Valley was either seen as a place to fundraise money from, from Democrats, frankly, or a place that was starting to become like scary in the evolution of technology and to regulate. But of course, this is also an industry that is our largest industry, that is a major driver of growth. And so I think that lack of strategic orientation also kind of helped the relationship go off the rails. That's not saying I blame, that doesn't excuse Elon Musk's behavior, for instance, but it created a bit of space for the evolution we've seen. And I say that because that strikes me as something that is feasible to shift, is that I think, Democrats, any pro-democracy administration, moderate Republicans, et cetera, they just have a view on what's the future of our economy. Where's AI going? Where's workforce going? How do we work productively with industry? And also, how do we regulate it? And that kind of conversation and relationship has to be built. And I think that is going to be part of what makes sure that this pull towards authoritarianism doesn't get more currency. You're not necessarily going to pull everyone back, but there's no reason more and more tech people should be going in that direction if there is a productive vision and view that they play some role in around where our economy goes. So I'm not saying there's never a moment that government and business isn't adversarial in some ways. Of course, there are times, but it also feels incredibly unstrategic to not be working with various industries that are drivers of growth to figure out a direction for this country that is productive and doesn't reduces the appeal of authoritarianism. The other thing that has created an appeal of authoritarianism that goes far beyond tech is this feeling that government isn't delivering, right? We need some to deliver, and you think back to the 1930s and Mussolini made the trains run on time, right? Like that's part of the appeal in general for the American public. And I think that business is not dissimilar to Americans in feeling frustration at the ability of government to deliver. And so I do think leaders who demonstrate that ability to deliver, I think we're seeing it increasingly. I think governors are interesting in this regard. I think all the candidates that were successful in the most recent election are, had a narrative that spoke about getting things done, addressing affordability, making government work better. So that's a promising direction. If we can pair leaders who are good at getting things done, which is our focus, we want those leaders who get things done, who are effective, who are pragmatic. That's another ingredient to bringing people back from their desire to go towards authoritarianism. But look, I'm concerned that there is a set of guys who are, with a lot of resources who are promoting a kind of pro-authoritarian vision. But I think there are plenty of people with just the same intellectual chops who can push in other directions, and we shouldn't be afraid to. And we shouldn't be afraid to do it with other tech leaders and emerging tech leaders and the MBA students that we have, for instance, in our student chapters. They're a pillar of people who don't see things that way. And the worst thing to do would be to just paint all of business with that brush.
Yeah.
Because then you're kind of encouraging people to go. You're like, oh, you're a business, go join them, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to do.
No, I think for me, if there's one takeaway from your conversation, which is a point that is nice to just hear stated out loud, which is that the business community is not Elon Musk, right? And it's not Peter, right? That's an obvious point.
But the business community knows how problematic Elon Musk is. I mean, not that he has no admirers and not that he's never done anything that is effective, but the collective impact or set of things that Musk have done has many things that people are well aware. And I mean, obviously he got pushed, his whole foray into government was a failure in multiple levels, right?
One thing we've observed in the last several months is the government is taking a different role in the economy, not just with tariffs, but also directly interfacing with companies in unique ways, taking a stake in Intel, for example. And people have labeled this practice state capitalism. I don't think we're quite there in the American context. That's a term we use to describe the Chinese political economy. But nevertheless, it's interesting. And it's often done actually to it's justified in terms of being able to compete with China and other things. We see that language being used. I'm wondering what you're seeing from the business community about this type of practice and the US government taking a financial stake in companies or being more interventionist in different ways.
Look, It's not totally unprecedented, of course, for the government to play some role in different industries. We saw that with renewables, right? There's kind of subsidies to incentivize green technologies. So, and you've seen during financial crisis as well, right? During the financial crisis, you saw in the auto industry. So it's not unprecedented for there to be some intervention of government. However, in this case, we're seeing it in a way that's haphazard, that's based on uh, kind of deciding that you don't like what one company is doing, or you want to intervene in an industry like crypto, or um, so I think the nature of those interventions is surprising. The tariffs being a different flavor of that, right? Which is both the imposition of tariffs in ways that are unhelpful to the market, but also the variability, uncertainty, the type of decision making. So I think it's not accurate to say we can make a blanket statement about the role between government and business in specific industries. Obviously, too much intervention from government, I think, has a lot of risks of being ineffective, but some degree of regulation and engagement is not surprising. But it's the haphazard element, it's the clarity of decision making, it's the consistency of applying that across an industry versus just choosing a particular company here or there. So that's what worries me, is that type of interventionalist, personalized, chaotic decision making that then is really, uh, a big risk for companies because they don't know what's next. And we see that in the markets as well. I mean, certainly many who are um, in the equity market know that there's insider behavior happening, right? And it's never good to be on the other side of a
Yeah, yeah.
trade where there's insiders. And I think that's kind of a, a worst kept secret on Wall Street right now, that there are insider traders who are engaging in the market with information from the administration.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not equipped to be able to really weigh in on that too well, but it just sort of all the tariff announcements, especially in this past spring, where the market would move, the tweet would go out and the market would move, and if someone knew that tweet was company coming, they could of course make a fortune on that kind of thing. I mean, I think what I took from your point just now is there's a difference between sort of chaotic, personalized moves and a broader strategy. And you could look at like the Chips and Science Act. I don't know if I would label that state capitalism. I would think it's probably just what we would call industrial policy, and
Right.
thoughtful industrial policy to deal with the global economy and potentially a strategic rival. There's nothing wrong with that. What's problematic is when it becomes wrapped up in corruption, or it's chaotic and haphazard, unpredictable, and not tied to some broader strategic goal.
Yeah. And look, industrial policy in any given industry can be debated, right? But that's the purview of Congress and our lawmakers, right? To reach some agreement on if or how to do industrial policy. And it should be debated because it's a very tricky thing to do well. But it shouldn't sit uh, in this very consolidated way with the president and with kind of a set of actions that are very hard to rationalize from a strategic industry perspective.
Well, and this ties to a broader question about our two-party system right now, which is we have the Republican Party embracing tariffs and protectionism, and then there are parts of the Democratic Party that are embracing um, also sort of non-market policies aimed at redistribution and so forth. And we might debate whether or not this isn't the place to debate whether or not these policies are effective. But just as a diagnosis of what's going on, this means that like what exactly is the party of the market right now? What is the party of free trade? And there's always this flirtation with a third party. Like, is this a moment for like that unity party, that moderate middle to emerge? I don't know what you're seeing among the business community, but it's striking to me that now both parties, in different ways, are abandoning kind of the free market, neoliberal globalization policies that have been the bedrock of our system for decades. And maybe it's because those policies weren't working. And I think it's important to say that is that the average American for many different reasons, might feel disaffected with that status quo. But I'm curious what you're seeing in the business community about this bifurcation of the political space.
Yeah, look, I think the big picture is that the center does not feel well represented, whether you're in business or a kind of someone who considers yourself somewhere towards the center, concerned with what feels like extremes, um, or aggressive policy positions on the left or right. And so I'm not convinced that um, business is looking for entire, a free market absolutist type of position, which you might have talked about in, the 90s or early 2000s, et cetera. But I do think a, a policy agenda that is conscious of building competitiveness of our economy, doing that in a way that enables broad-based growth, et cetera, is something that many business people would be looking for. And I think right now for the two parties, whoever can be most effective at building a big enough tent and reaching into independents and more kind of centrist type voters is going to be effective. And what's interesting, I mean, we're just after the first election from since the president was inaugurated, and uh, two of I mentioned early, Mike Sherrill and Abigail Spanberger is running for governor. It looks like they won by 13% each. It looks like they were able to capture a lot of independents. They were able to capture a lot of people who considered themselves moderates. And so seems to me the basics of what many Americans want, what business wants, to feel like we're not in the midst of chaos. We're not just kind of at each other's throats. We don't have the crazy of a president who's announcing things on a daily basis on his Truth Social account. So I think it was a vote for sanity,
Yeah, yeah.
and I think we shouldn't assume that business is totally dissimilar in its interests to, or business people are not terribly dissimilar in their interests to many other Americans.
Thank you for that. We're getting close to our time, and I wanted to leave a little space for a more personal question, which is, you're someone who's had just a really interesting career, starting out at Bain in the private sector, launching Dahlberg, which is kind of business with a heart, focusing on consulting. I have students who want to work for that organization, consulting for nonprofits, NGOs, and other things, and now a Leadership Now, which is doing really important work in the almost an activist and social movement type role. Do you have any lessons learned, or we have some listeners who are early in their careers who are thinking about how they can affect change, and you've done that in many different ways in your life. What is your kind of 1 to 2 pieces of advice for folks who are just starting out?
Well, two things. I think from a career perspective, I felt very fortunate that I started my career early on. For instance, at Bain, I'd studied engineering. I was, interested in the world and just understanding how organizations worked. And I got a really great grounding of that early in my career by working at Bain in South Africa and London and the US, and just seeing many organizations and cultural contexts, and then was able to, build Dahlberg, to serve as a senior advisor to the Secretary of State in the Obama administration, first Clinton and then Kerry. And I was, I think, not worrying each time about, am I kind of doing a linear process within one industry? I was seeing where my skills and the things that I cared about uh, could be realized in different contexts. But in each time, I was building on something that I had before. So when I went in to serve in government, which was totally new to me, to be in government, but I was the senior advisor on for the Secretary of State on international development. And one of the things we were doing was working on the negotiations of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's something I had worked on at Dahlberg and really understood the players. So while the context was different, I was working with political leaders that I didn't have experience with. I had a substantive basis that allowed me to do that. And same thing with leadership now, coming to the domestic US political context was new, but it built on the people and networks that I had from Harvard Business School, from government, from my personal networks, et cetera, that enabled to create a foundation. And certainly my academic networks were critical in that. So it created a foundation. So I think just thinking about what do you really care about? How do you use the assets you have, even when you go across contexts, and really going across sectors if you can, is so valuable because those experience across business, government, et cetera, have made my um, professional experience and ability to find paths to impact so much richer. The second thing I would say is um, drawing on, I think I have drawn on my personal experience before, as growing up in New York City, going to New York City public schools, seeing, just kind of experiencing what um, uh, government did in ways that were really important to my personal development, whether it was the public schools in New York, the Pell Grants that funded my college education. I kept that with me in terms of maintaining an appreciation for whatever you're achieving in life comes from some foundations, whether it's your family, the institutions that our government has, et cetera, that we need to keep in mind as we're building towards future generations. And I have children now who are teenagers, and I really think about the future that they're going to have in this country and how do we create a system that is positive and inspiring and makes people feel good again about this country and the role they can play. And it's tragic to me if they don't have that experience. And I think that is definitely something I share with many Leadership Now members. Whatever level of executive you are, is you want a future for this country and your children that um, lives up to the potential of America. And so I, feel that kind of commitment is what we all need, whether we're a political leader or business or a nonprofit or in academia, like reminding ourselves of those kind of core principles, experiences is what gets us through times that can be pretty tough.
Well, now it's good. We've ended on our misty-eyed note about patriotism and
Yeah.
democracy. A lot of my sessions end there, and I think it's healthy because it is a challenging time, and to end with a little bit of optimism and perspective is always welcome. Daniella, thank you so much for joining me. Folks who are listening, if you want to learn more about Leadership Now, you can visit their website. And Daniella also has a newsletter, which I believe is published through LinkedIn, so you can find Daniella on LinkedIn. Daniella, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be here, Rory.
Thank you.